Part 3. I'm debating on how much to tell my daughter about Ed. I don't want to scare her more than necessary, but I think life may have gone much differently for me, especially in my younger years, had there been someone who knew about Ed to give me even an iota of advice. I am going to talk to her, but I need to get past writing about the boys in the salt field first. I need to try and remember that level of fear so that I can choose my words wisely. I need her to understand that there are worse monsters than Ed in the world. Since starting to come forward with my story, something I have been frequently asked is if Ed is tied to me somehow, as it doesn't seem like he's actually trying to kill me, or even hurt me. While I agree that I would be dead by now if Ed wanted to kill me, and while the whole purpose of me telling my story is to answer questions I've long had about Ed, not all of the torment over the years has been psychological and emotional. Ed has caused me physical harm, both directly and indirectly, though I admit that I am probably to blame for much of it. Charlie the Catman continued his mission of trying to horrify anyone who would give him the time by ranting his mad ideas and showing off his growing collection of decapitated cats. I only saw the contents of that first bag, but in the small trailer park community, gossip spreads as fast as it does on social media today. He wasn't some secret pervert, trying to flash women from behind a bush before running off to find another victim. He asked his questions and displayed the contents of his bag out in the open, unaware or unconcerned that he was doing anything wrong at all. If I gave as little care as Charlie did when it came to uncovering the truth, this story might not even be necessary. A lot changed for me in the few weeks after Charlie dumped the kitten at our feet and stole my ice cream. At the end of the previous school year, a nice lady had given me a bunch of tests consisting of questions, doodling, and playing with blocks. To me, it was fun. To the school district, it meant I was gifted and talented and needed to attend a new school with the rest of the kids in the GATE, Gifted and Talented Education program. This also meant a change in bus routes, and it was on the new bus that I met Daniel, who would go on to become my best friend, until Ed ruined that too. Daniel lived in the same trailer park as me, which was great news, until I found out that he lived 2 trailers down from Charlie. I thought my mom would forbid me from playing with him because of the close proximity, but she surprised me. Her reactions to isolated events didn't bleed into her everyday opinion. That Charlie was just a neighborhood crazy, meant to be avoided but not feared. I keep bringing up the boys in the salt fields, and that part of the story is coming soon, but they are important here because until that incident, my parents trusted me and didn't suffocate me with worry. They still wanted me to be safe. I would get in trouble if I forgot to wear my helmet while riding my bike, for example. But so long as I stayed within the confines of the trailer park, I could ride my bike wherever I wanted. The only real rule was to call when I got somewhere and before I left again. It annoyed me, but breaking that rule never ended well, and following it saved my life on at least one occasion, so I went along with it well into my teens. I didn't have many close friends before Daniel. He was more of a risk-taker where I was afraid of pain and getting into trouble. His dad had taught him curse words that even my own dad, a Navy sailor, had never uttered. I was spending more time outside, exploring the trailer park, and having a generally good time being a kid. I started taking more risks when hanging out with Daniel because I didn't want him to think I was a coward. I don't like to think of it as peer pressure, as Daniel never forced me to do anything, but since he was a couple of years older than I was, there was a sort of self-pressure in play. My mom would let me walk with him to the bus stop, allowing my grandmother, who lived with us and slept in the living room, to sleep in most mornings. The bus stop was located right outside of the entrance to the trailer park, in front of a flower shop shaped like a giant yellow basket of flowers. The shopping strip next to the flower shop had a laundromat, a Mexican food restaurant, a bar, and a store that had stickers covering the front windows. Max's, the store covered in stickers, sold smoking accessories, tobacco and marijuana, skateboarding stuff, and gag gifts for adults. The stickers covered the windows to keep people from seeing the wide selection of posters along the walls and the ceiling, most of which depicted topless or naked women. There were enough spaces in between the stickers for us to peek through, even in the early morning when Max's was dark, and I spent more days than I care to admit filling my imagination with the women in those pictures before the loud squeal of bus brakes would startle me into a full sprint, lest I have to explain to my mom why I missed my ride to school. If we weren't peering through the windows, we were scavenging the area around the dumpster for mischievous little presents to add to the box we kept hidden beneath the back staircase of my trailer. Max's had a habit of throwing perfectly good products away, most likely because the people who frequented the store weren't looking for fake dog poo and stink bombs. Every so often, there would be boxes of porno mags with the covers torn off. Though I did a ton of things I never would have before my friendship with Daniel, I never let him talk me into carrying the magazines to school like he often did. My parents didn't make sex or nudity some evil, sinful taboo. In fact, they joked about some pretty adult things around us to the point where I had a pretty good grasp of the ins and outs well before I was sat down for the dreaded sex talk. But the thought of what would happen if I got caught with a penthouse at school was enough to dispel my curiosity. The problem with being young and not understanding peer pressure is that it becomes an easy habit to fall into, even though, as I said, I was the one putting pressure on myself when it came to Daniel. There was a kid in our trailer park named JJ, who I'm sure is rotting away in prison as I type this. Where Daniel and I stretched rules out of excitement or curiosity, JJ broke them, kicked them, and lit them on fire because he genuinely enjoyed being a violent, manipulative bully. One day, when Daniel was sick, JJ managed to talk me into peeling stickers from the large glass facade of Max's, claiming that his dad knew the store owner and he left them out there for kids to take whenever they wanted. I was wary of his words, but I have to admit that the thought of the cool skull sticker on my school binder gave me daydreams of popularity that overpowered my trepidation. Halfway through peeling back the first sticker, the front door of Max's burst open, and a skinny man wearing nothing but a pair of jeans and upper body tattoos ran out, waving a knife and yelling at us. I ran to the bus stop, hoping that the two moms who always walked their kids to the bus stop would keep me safe. JJ didn't run so much as he backed away at a fast pace, luring the knife-wielding store owner toward the safe spot with a string of taunts and curse words. When the man reached the bus stop, he turned his attention to me, pointing the knife at me as if it were a reprimanding finger instead of a sharp weapon, while JJ stood by and laughed. The two mothers, who spoke no English, barely reacted. "I'm calling the cops on you little brats." I stammered out an apology while JJ told him to do something anatomically improbable. After a long time, the man bent down and grabbed me by the shirt with his free hand and said, "If you ever touch my windows again, if I ever see you again, I'll kill you. Do you understand me?" I nodded. JJ spit at the man. As the store owner walked away, he kept assuring us that he would be calling the cops and pressing charges. Adults were basically gods to me, so I spent the rest of the day worrying that the cops were going to show up for me at school, or worse, that the man would be waiting for me at the bus stop to make good on his promise to kill me if he ever saw me again. To top it off, I ended the day with a note from my teacher informing my mom of my inattentiveness and distracting behavior. I remember vividly that it was a Tuesday, and I've hated Tuesdays ever since. I was sent to my room for the day as punishment, only coming out to eat dinner and bathe. I was still worried that the tattooed man would make good on his promise if he had seen me getting off the bus after school or something, so I gripped my Swiss Army knife, with the blade flipped open, tightly under my pillow as I tried to fall asleep. The tattooed man didn't come for me that night, or any other night for that matter, but Ed did. It was Ed's first visit since the room had been rearranged, which meant that the foot of my bed was now directly beneath the open window. With the fan running, I didn't hear him, but I did feel the mattress shift as he lowered onto it. As I was already uneasy from the events of the day, it awoke me instantly, and I sat up with a fast jerk, jabbing the knife out in front of me with a snarl. The knife punctured Ed's arm just below the shoulder. He opened his mouth wide and hissed at me, the full stench of his breath smacking me in the face as saliva flew into my wide-open eyes. I let go of the knife, and the heft of it fell against his body. At least half of the blade still stuck into his arm. "I'm sorry," I said to him, and I meant it. Yes, the first words I ever spoke to the thing that has haunted me my entire life was an apology. The corners of his mouth were downturned, reminding me of a shark, as he turned his large head to look down at the knife. He shook his arm, causing the knife to swing back and forth for a moment before finally falling from his arm. The long fingers at the end of his uninjured arm went to the wound, and when he pulled it away and held one of the fingers up for me to see, the tip was smeared with something dark and flowing. At first, Ed stared at me with what looked like sad confusion, as if of the two of us, I was the monster. The moment was so much like E.T. that I reached a finger out towards his, fully expecting it to glow and for his wound to disappear. Instead, his forehead wrinkled and he growled, snapping his large, sharp teeth at my own finger before smacking me hard in the face with his blood-stained hand. My head snapped sideways. By the time I turned to face him again, there was nothing at the foot of my bed but the familiar pile of toys and my Swiss Army knife, still covered in Ed's blood. At first, I worried about how I was going to explain the bloody knife and the trail of red droplets covering the foot of my bed, some of my dolls, and the windowsill, but then my nose started bleeding. I was relieved. My mom wasn't nearly as thrilled when I woke her up a few minutes later. After her hysterics died down, and I explained that I woke up with a bloody nose, she blamed it on the heat and helped me clean up. Heat-related nosebleeds were something that happened to me a lot as a child, and still do on occasion as an adult. The only reason she had freaked out is because I had taken the time to clean up and hide the Swiss Army knife, so by the time I woke her up for help, the lower half of my face was a waterfall of blood. Apparently, I had looked like a monster in the dark, and it had frightened her something awful. Hilarious, right? Ed returned the following night. I was much less on edge than I had been the night before, so even though I felt the bed shake as he entered the room, I was much slower to wake up. When I sat up, I saw that Ed wasn't at the foot of my bed. He was at the head of my baby brother's, perched over him and staring at me with the same frustrated expression on his face from the night before. He pointed to the wound on his arm, which had scabbed over thick and black, before pointing to my brother. I shook my head, confused, and whispered, "I don't understand." He grunted before pointing at his wound again, then at my brother, and finally raised his uninjured arm into the air, parallel with James's chest. In his hand was my Swiss Army knife. I understood then. I tried to leap across the bed to stop him, but he lifted his empty hand, pointed at me, and lowered the knife halfway to my brother's exposed chest. I stopped moving, and Ed grinned. "I'm sorry," I repeated my apology from the night before. Ed shook his head violently and growled, lowering the knife more. "Please, don't!" I whispered as loud as I was able to, causing James to stir in his sleep. Ed nodded his head once, up and down, and leapt from his spot on James's bed to the foot of mine so fast that I flung myself backwards with surprise. He held the knife toward me, pointing at the wound on his arm with the opposite hand, and opened his mouth, my own words coming back to me in my own voice. "Please, don't!" He then threw the knife to the ground next to my bed, growled once more, and leapt through the open window. It was the second time in 2 days I had been threatened with a knife. I was no longer worried about the man who had threatened me with words, as his promise had proven to be empty. Ed had chosen action to convey his threat, and I took his promise as gospel. When I say he opened his mouth and my words came out, I don't mean that he spoke them. His mouth didn't move along with the words. He had simply opened it, and they flew out from his throat like a frantic echo excitedly escaping a cave. His voice, my voice, repeated those words over and over again in my head. I had never heard him speak, and I suppose I still hadn't, but it was something new, and fascination slowly replaced the terror. Both the fear and fascination kept me awake, and I slept like hell that night. I was written up again the following day for being the worst kind of inattentive and disrespectful hellion to a substitute teacher. I didn't want to be stuck in the room again after the previous night, so I simply threw the note away on the bus and didn't tell my mom. It's amazing what children think they can get away with when they don't know how the world works. My teacher called home the next day, concerned as to why the note hadn't been returned with a signature, and I felt the wrath of my transgressions stinging my backside any time I tried to sit for days afterward. After homework, I rode my bike to Daniel's. Charlie was yelling something inaudible as I passed his trailer, but I was too focused on ending the day on a positive note to pay attention to what it was. I was hoping for video games or something, but Daniel's mom wasn't in the best mood that day, and we were forced to make our own fun outside. We found a couple of kids to play hide and seek with for a while. It may sound childish, but hide and seek is a great game when you have a pretty big trailer park full of secret nooks and paths at your disposal. It was before sunset, when the clouds turned the light pink of cotton candy, as we walked our bikes back to Daniel's trailer. As we passed Charlie's trailer, we heard him screaming again at the top of his lungs about how someone was coming to get him. Same old Charlie. From the street level, all that was visible of the inside was a darkened room through a small window. Daniel stopped his bike and picked up a couple of small rocks from the street. Want to give him something to scream about? He grinned and threw a rock at the side of the trailer. The yelling stopped for just a moment before picking back up, more shrill than it had been before. Normally, this was the kind of activity I would avoid, even with my best friend instigating it. But I was still grumpy from the lack of sleep and in a general bad mood about the trouble I had gotten into that day, so I joined in. The yelling picked up again, each sentence punctuated by the plink of a rock on the side of Charlie's trailer. "Call the police!" Blink. "They're trying to kill me!" Blink. "Help me before they take me away!" Blink. I'm not proud of that day, but I won't lie about the small bit of satisfaction young me felt taking my frustrations out on the Catman. At one point, we heard Charlie's glass door slide and drop the rocks. He came out onto his deck, clad only in boots and white underwear, pointing at us with a fly swatter. "There they are! Help! They're trying to get me!" We hopped on our bikes and sped away as he screamed after us, laughing all the while. We waited around the corner at the end of the street until his yelling died down. We talked about episodes of X-Men and Mortal Kombat, peeking around the corner every few minutes until Charlie finally disappeared from the street. At that point, we went back to Daniel's so that I could call my mom. She offered to pick me up, as it was close to dark outside, but I told her that I wasn't a baby and that I'd be home soon. I really wish I had taken her up on that ride. As it was the shorter route, I walked my bike past Charlie's house, not wanting the sound of the bike to alert him in case he was still listening. I kept my eyes locked onto his front door as I passed, as if it were a staring contest that would result in the underwear-clad lunatic popping from his trailer if I were to blink or turn away. As I passed his porch, my eyes went up to the dark window and I froze. Peering down at me from the now open windowsill of the Catman's trailer was Ed. He leapt down from the window, and I leapt onto my bike and pedaled as fast as it would carry me. At the end of the street, I pressed backward on the pedals, causing me to skid sideways and look back towards Charlie's, sure that Ed would be chasing me. Instead, he was just standing on the street, smiling at me. After a moment, he reached down and picked up a rock. He pointed at it, pointed at me, and opened his mouth wide, the same as he had the night before. And like the night before, my own voice came out of his mouth. "Please, don't!" It was a warm night, but my spine grew cold. Still staring at Ed, I began to pedal forward, only to have a pair of headlights blind me and a loud horn leave a ringing in my ears. I had been so focused on Ed that I hadn't noticed the car approaching, and my pedaling had taken me into the opposite lane. The car had missed me by inches. I apologized profusely as the driver yelled at me through their closed window, not stopping as they turned down the street. As their headlights flooded the area where Ed had been a moment before, I saw that he was gone. Of course he was. I wanted to let the heavy, anxious feeling in my stomach go away before I got home, but as I didn't know where Ed was and was unsure what he would do to me out in the open, I used the fear-induced adrenaline to pedal home in record time. Each turn of the bike gears sounded like his wheezing, and I had the creeping feeling that I was being followed all the way home, but I didn't dare look behind me again. When I arrived at my trailer, nothing was behind me. My mom realized something was wrong almost immediately. "You're so pale! Were you drinking water?" Not waiting for me to answer, she thrust a cup of juice she had been drinking towards me. "Drink this before you get more dehydrated." "No, I'm fine, just tired." I could have left it at that, but for some reason I added, "Charlie just spooked me a bit." "That terrible man," she grumbled. "He's going to go too far one of these days. Did he grab at you again?" "No, nothing like that. Just more screaming." She nodded and hugged me close. "Dinner is in the microwave. Why don't you eat and take a bath?" "Do you mind if I take a bath first?" "Of course. Don't fill it too much. I still have to give James a bath." "Okay, Mom." As I walked toward the bathroom, I felt her eyes on me, as if she wanted to ask more, but was unsure what to ask. Charlie had spooked me a bit, and Charlie seemed to be the go-to person to blame for anything out of the ordinary in the trailer park, so I hadn't really lied. The same thing that kept her from pressing me further kept me from telling her about Ed. Even if I could find the right words, would it really do any good to speak them? It took a while to fall asleep that night, as I fully expected a visit from Ed after the earlier events. I stared at the window for hours while my brothers snored lightly, confident that I would finally see where he came from if I could only stay awake, as if I were waiting for Santa Claus instead of Ed the Head Eater. I focused on the light from the pool that flooded the street 3 blocks down, causing the middle of the street to look like a stage flooded with a single spotlight waiting for a lone performer to seduce or annoy the audience with a spoken word. Eventually, I grew bored and tired and began to yawn every few minutes. I was losing my resolve as the previous night's exhaustion caught up to me, and was close to giving up when, after a long, tear-inducing yawn, I wiped the moisture that blurred my vision away to see a figure standing in the middle of the spotlight, head whipping from side to side as if searching for something. The incoherent mutters of the stranger echoed down the street and into my room. My momentary excitement that staying awake had paid off faded away. A moment later, the man screamed a single high-pitched word and ran from the spotlight, furthering my frustration. "Help!" It was Charlie the Catman, of course. Any time I think of that night, I am reminded of the story about the boy who cried wolf. In it, some little jerk keeps calling wolf, day in and day out, to screw with the townsfolk and garner some kind of sympathy. The story ends with an actual wolf attacking him, and his cries of wolf go ignored because everyone is sick of responding to his false screams of desperation. Charlie the Catman's story had a similar arc, and that night, beneath the stage-like spotlight, I saw the conclusion of his story play out. I was too young to know what an encore was, and I doubt I would have acted any differently if I did, but I sometimes wonder what I would have seen had I been patient and kept my eyes on the stage for a few moments longer. Instead, I drowned out his frantic screams for help by turning my fan on high and focusing on the loud whir it produced until I grudgingly fell asleep. That night was the last time I ever saw Charlie the Catman. I didn't think much of his absence in the days that followed, but a week later the flashing lights of cop cars and an ambulance poured from the street Daniel lived on. My mom, seeing that I was worried about my friend, walked down with me to ask an officer what happened. Her father had been a policeman for 3 decades, and she had been on her way to becoming a cop herself before she married my dad, so she knew the right questions to ask. As she approached an officer, I could see that Daniel was fine. He stood with his mother and sister on the other side of the mass of policemen and vehicles. We waved at each other, and I pointed and shrugged, asking him wordlessly what was going on. He shrugged back, but pointed at Charlie's house. I noticed the side window where I had last seen Ed had been covered with tinfoil, but as that didn't explain the police, I didn't care. I pointed at my mom and gave him a thumbs up, hoping he understood that I would share whatever information she found out. I couldn't hear what the cop and her talked about, but her face was pale and contorted, as if she might be sick. As she took my hand and led me away, I asked, "What happened?" She hesitated and swallowed heavily before saying, "It's Charlie. He passed away a few days ago." To most children, the death of a known person is a sad thing, even if that person was a lunatic who carried dead animals around in grocery bags. On top of that sadness, which welled up as salty tears in my eyes, I felt guilt that the last encounter I had with Charlie involved me throwing rocks at his house. As I couldn't tell my mother that, I simply said, "Oh no." I wiped my nose, and after a few moments asked her, "What about the cats? Are they okay? If it's been days, they must be so hungry." At that, her cheeks bulged, and she let go of my hand. She stumbled to the side of the street and vomited. When she was done, she said that the sad news had made her feel unwell, and asked if I could entertain myself so she could nap when we got home. I looked at her, waiting for an answer to my question, and she sighed and wiped her mouth with the back of her arm. "The cats are fine, sweetheart, I promise." Even as a child, I had a deep concern for animals. I pressed her further. "But how are the cats going to eat?" My own sullen demeanor brightened as an idea came into my head. "Can I bring them food from our house until they find new homes?" "They don't need any more food, dear." She looked down at me with heavy, swimming eyes, and I was sure she was going to throw up again. Instead, she took a deep breath and said in a grim voice, "They've had plenty to eat." I didn't think it was a very good answer, but she still looked pale, and I didn't want to make her puke again, so I filed the questions away to ask Daniel on the bus the next day, hoping that he would know something since he lived so close. He wasn't on the morning bus, but I saw him on the playground when my own bus arrived at school and bombarded him with excited questions. Disappointingly, he wanted to wait to talk about it until after school so that we wouldn't be overheard. He did tell me that he had overheard the cops talking about some weird things, and that he had seen the EMTs roll Charlie out to the ambulance. That practically made him an expert, and 1,000 questions that I wanted to ask ran through my head at once. By the time I saw Daniel again 2 days later, I had forgotten every single one of those questions. There have been a lot of firsts in this story so far. The first time I was visited by Ed, the first time I saw Ed, the first time I heard his voice, or at least a mimic of my own. That day at school, the day that Daniel and I made plans to discuss what happened to Charlie the Catman, marked 2 more significant firsts in my childhood. It was the first, and last, time that I crapped my pants at school, which is the reason I didn't see my best friend until 2 days later. The reason why I crapped my pants is because of the other first that day. It was the first time I saw Ed the Head Eater in the daylight.